It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, dig into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Billy Hallowell, and we're going to be discussing his new book, Playing with Fire, a modern investigation into demons, exorcism, and ghosts. Billy, it is truly an honor, sir. Welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, Billy, in my world, everybody knows who you are, but inevitably you are going to be new to somebody watching this, listening to this. So let's kick off our conversation with a bit of what we might call the Billy Hallowell origin story. Feel free to insert superhero references, but more than anything, for the men and women who are meeting you for the first time today, what do they need to know about you?
Wow, that's great. Superhero references. Man, now I got to really think. So, I've been working in media for a long time, in faith media. I started out actually at The Blaze. I was the faith editor there for about 5.5 years. And that's obviously a news and politics site. So my initial passions, I'm a lifelong Christian, but we're really news and politics. I thought I'm going to work in news and politics forever. And then God was like, no, you're not. You're going to keep going into the faith world. I'm going to keep turning you back into faith. And, it's amazing looking back now, because having had the chance, and this too, getting to interview people, your faith is your most important thing in your life. So to be able to connect what I get to do for a living with that has been amazing. So I worked at FaithWire. I was a senior editor at FaithWire after The Blaze, and a number of other places. But really now it's so interesting. God has been like, okay, now I'm going to take you out of media, day-to-day media, and put you in Christian entertainment. So I've been working at PureFlix. I'm the director of communications at PureFlix and content. And so I host the podcast at PureFlix and also help with marketing, communications, kind of do a lot of different things there. So, but have not stopped in media. I still have a syndicated work that goes out to Christian Post and The Blaze and other sites. And so that's a quick overview. I don't have any superhero references there. I wish I had the superhero power of more time and more sleep. Those are two things I could use.
Yes, I think for people who are producing lots of content right now, we all wish we had more time. One, so we could make it better, because editing can be a huge time suck. And two, we just want to talk to more people, have more fantastic conversations. One more kind of origin story theme question before we move on to the book. If we head to your website, we see right at the top, faith, culture, and storytelling. When did you decide those were your kind of three themes for life for the work you're going to do? Always curious to hear where those things come from.
Yeah, I've always had this kind of obsession with culture. And I think I'll start there. I think that's where my passion for politics had come from. But then I realized, well, politics doesn't solve the heart, right? It solves issues that might be happening right now. But then even there's some debate. So I started thinking culture, what impacts culture? Well, media impacts culture. Hollywood impacts culture. Universities, obviously the church, but I'm talking about things outside of the church. And so culture became a focal point because we're seeing culture change so dramatically, and it has happened in the last 20 years. I mean, when you pull up the Gallup statistics on opinions on issues in this country, it's almost terrifying, the relativism that we're seeing in culture and sort of the decay. And so culture is a real passion area. And then obviously faith, understanding the Christian faith, going into areas that are uncomfortable sometimes, difficult. That's been something that, and I think even with this book, that I've been kind of pushed to do. I feel like God has kind of led me to do. And then storytelling. It's so crazy to me. And I'm not saying I'm the best storyteller in the world, but I love storytelling. I think you look at Jesus, he told stories. He explained things through stories. He was the best storyteller that ever lived, right? And so, and then I look at culture and faith, and how did culture change? It changed because one side, the secular side, really got good at storytelling, and they were able to do it through not just Hollywood, but media. And so I think we have to be good at storytelling, because that's how we communicate and connect emotionally with people. So those are the three areas that I really believe I'm called to. And I think as Christians, a lot of us are called into those arenas.
Well, Billy, thanks for giving us the quick flyover of your backstory. Next, let's move into the book. Just like every author has an origin story, I feel like every book writing journey has an origin story as well. So I'd be curious to hear what started you down the path of researching the occult. This isn't a space that everybody in our Christian media, Christian publishing world is willing to go down. It's a unique rabbit hole.
Yeah, and let me be fully honest, I didn't want to write the book. So in the end, I'm glad I did. So let me let me say, I'm glad I wrote it. It was the best experience. But this is a topic. When I was working at the Blaze, there was a case in 2014 that made international headlines. It was in Gary, Indiana, and I talk about this in the book. And it really caught my eye because very rarely do you have a mainstream media outlet taking up a story of alleged possession, right? And so this was a mother and her 3 kids out in Indiana, and they claimed to have an experience of possession in their house. And when you read the story, and this was in the Indianapolis Star initially, and we covered it at the Blaze, it was remarkable because there was sourcing. There were sheriffs and police officers, CPS workers, people on the record validating the claims that this family had, or at least saying we saw things we can't explain. And so I covered a number of stories like that. And now I look back and I'm like, okay, God was sort of preparing me to dive deeper into this topic. I found it interesting. I always have enjoyed scary movies. I think my perspective has changed a little bit in recent years on some of that, but I've always enjoyed those kinds of things. So I loved covering it. And then you sort of flash forward. I was talking with a publishing company a few years ago, and this topic came up, and I had done a book on the end times. And so kind of through a journalistic lens, and I thought, well, it'd be really interesting to do a book on, the occult and demons and possession. But then I had the book deal. It was offered to me and I prayed about it and I just didn't feel right about it. And I was like, something's not right about this at this moment right now. I'm not going to do this. And then I actually had some people I knew who went through some experiences. And so there was this time period where I thought, wow, this is really interesting. I've covered these things. I've read about them. Now I'm seeing them sort of happen with people around me. And then very strangely, this opportunity came up again to tackle this topic, and it happened in a conversation. I never filled out a proposal for a book, and anybody who's written a book will know that you usually do that. God just sort of dropped it on my lap, and I prayed over it for 2 months. I mean, I had the contract, and I was like, is this the right thing to do? And it became very clear, and I think a lot of it was fear. I didn't really want to write the book because I didn't really understand, and I think a lot of Christians, if we admit it, we really might not fully understand these issues. They freak us out. We're afraid. We don't realize we have authority over these things as Christians. And so, long story short, I felt a peace about it. I jumped into the project, and honestly, it was the most amazing, peaceful experience out of any of the books I've had a chance to work on.
That's intriguing because I work with a lot of authors in the charismatic publishing space, and their ministries are focused on spiritual warfare and deliverance. And often in that space, they'll tell you when they write a book that is intensely focused on spiritual warfare or deliverance, that they feel like they come under a lot of attack and just have challenge after challenge. It doesn't sound like that was your experience at all in this project.
No, and that's why I didn't want to do. That's why I didn't want to do it, because I've heard those things, and I really made an effort to get up every single day. And we should be doing this anyway, but you know how it is. You get busy. You don't start with quiet time. You don't start with prayer. And then the whole day is kind of off. And I would go through months of not appropriately starting my day. But when I started the book, I was anticipating that. And so I very, very strongly was intent on reading the Bible every day, praying for the book, praying about it. Not that others aren't doing that. And I do think I know people who have gone through that. That was not my experience with this. I felt very peaceful throughout it. I felt like it almost wrote itself. I think also I was approaching it a little differently. I was approaching it by interviewing people. I wasn't giving my viewpoints. I was saying, what is this? Can you explain this to me? And going to people who had experienced it. I just felt like God kept opening doors. Here's this person's story. I would discover things or find things. And, at the end of the day, I have to say my experience was different. It was peaceful, and I left it with a real understanding of, okay, this is what this is. And there may be debates about different elements of it. We know it's true. The New Testament is filled with this content. And so what does that mean for my faith? And it actually encouraged my faith.
Oh, I'm glad that you shared that, because you intentionally went after seeking God's covering, seeking God's direction as you were working on this project. And so I feel like that's just a good reminder for any of us to do that, whether it's on a daily basis, but especially if we're pushing into a difficult project, something that God may want to use greatly. The more that we can be moving in the direction he wants us to move, and having a covering over us spiritually if it's a difficult topic. Hey, who doesn't need that every day in their life? I'd love to pull on the thread a little bit more related to sources. How did did you find people through word of mouth, through just, hey, you found something in a book or an article? These are difficult experiences, unique experiences. Some people will gladly share. Other people might be a little bit more hesitant to share what they've gone through. So how did you approach finding credible credible sources who are willing to share their stories?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is I didn't want to overload people with stories, so I made it at the beginning. I said, I'm only going to tell a few stories, and I want these to be stories that I feel are compelling. Now, anybody can make a story up, right? And that's the problem. One of the problems with this arena is that anybody can say they went through something, they experienced something, they can make it up. And this has happened. We know this has happened before with other stories, the heaven is for real. That story was not made up, but other stories like it where there have been issues and people have come forward and said, you know what, we didn't tell the truth. We made that up. Now, I go into these interviews in the book sort of saying, okay, here's the information we have in front of us. I'm going to make the best determination, and I'm going to find the best people I can to validate it. So the Indiana story, for instance, that particular story, I spoke with the priest who was involved in it, and I tracked down the sheriff who had handled it, one of the sheriffs who was involved. And I was able to talk with them. I did not talk with the family at the center of it. I spoke with them. And there was a lot of sourcing out there already, right? You had newspaper articles. I went back to the original sources. If CPS filed a report, what did that report say? And when you're reading a government document that is saying that a child walked up a wall and did a backflip essentially and landed on the ground, you have to say to yourself, wow, why would a government official write this up? It sounds insane. It sounds like, something a superhero would do, going back to superhero references, or the opposite of a superhero. But what is at the center of this? So it was really documentation, going through those stories. And, I also would talk to people and say, what's your take on this person? I kind of found people through other people I trusted. And I think that's a good way, to try to make sure, what was your experience with this person? Were they honest? And one woman whose story was fascinating to me, she's actually in a wheelchair due to her experience when she believed she was possessed, and threw herself, essentially dropped herself out of a window, two-story window, in the midst of this experience. And so you have these compelling stories, and I can't say for sure. I can present the information and let people choose what they want to believe. But what we do know very clearly is that Jesus repeatedly dealt with this issue, that Paul dealt with this issue, that we see it in Scripture. And so that, to me, is fascinating. And many of these accounts line up with one another in certain intriguing ways. So anyway, that's a lot to say. I have to add this. I also went back to newspaper articles. I found it very interesting in the 18 and 1900s when I was writing Playing with Fire to see that in the 18 and 1900s, you had articles, journalists talking about the Ouija board, talking about these claims. I think the media was much more willing back then. And people will say, oh, well, they were superstitious. But I think they were more connected to faith and understood these themes, and they were more willing to write about it. So it was fascinating to go back and see those sources.
And in terms of, this could be something you specifically share in the book, or it could be something you read in an article but you chose not to share. What was the most shocking or surprising possession-related story you encountered?
I think the two stories that stand out, it's the Indiana case, because that one is so well sourced, right? And you have people on the record talking about things. And when people are hesitant to talk to you, that is compelling to me. When people, now I'm a talker, so I'll talk to people. I'm open. I'll share things. But when people are not wanting to share because they're afraid of how it's going to be framed, or they're worried, that really shows me, okay, there might be something here. And I experienced that with the Indiana case. I've experienced that with a number of cases that I've looked into and investigated. But I also think The Exorcist, the movie, that the real life case, now this was in the 1940s, this was a long time ago, but the real life case that is based on is very interesting and very compelling. And for decades, the people involved in it did not want that case to be leaked out into the open. And here we have The Exorcist, we have books and movies based on, and TV shows based on this story. And so I found it compelling that 40 years later, the priests involved would say, man, we wish this story never got out. We wish that people didn't know about this. And that, again, was a Washington Post report. A reporter caught wind of that story in real life and wrote an article about it. And that is how The Exorcist came to be. right? So those two were very compelling, but there were others that I found incredibly compelling as well. And here's the thing, and then I'll let you ask your next question because there's so many details. When you're talking to people who have never had a mental health problem in their life, okay, they experience something in this period of time, and then they never have a mental health problem again. You have to ask yourself, okay, well, was it just a nervous breakdown? Was it or did something happen there that they cannot explain and that we cannot explain? And maybe we can explain it, but we don't want to maybe look at the supernatural elements of it. So anyway, there's some information for you on what was most compelling. There was a lot, though.
Well, I want to get back to that Hollywood theme. You'd mentioned horror movies at some point in the conversation, and I remember growing up, I loved a good horror flick to laugh. I think part of it is when we were younger, they were just so bad. The special effects were so pathetic where it was almost a comedy, even though it was supposed to be horror half the time. But today, in terms of Hollywood's obsession with the demonic and possession, our special effects are much better now. So things seem very believable and are rather scary. But there's just this obsession with darkness and demonic and possession. We've got demonic dolls that are on a rampage, killing people, and just crazy, crazy stuff. But in terms of Hollywood's obsession, why? Where does that come from? What are they trying to work out?
One of the things that was fascinating was to look at polling data on this, right? What do people believe? And 45% of Americans believe that it's possible that demons exist, or they believe they exist. So almost half the population is openly saying they believe this, and I think more people than that believe it. And so with Hollywood, what you have is this transfixion with the issue. Since the beginning of time, people have claimed to have gone through these experiences, right? This is not something that emerged in the 1800s or the 1900s. People have talked about possession or similar spiritual experiences since the beginning of time. And so we have a real interest in it. People want to understand it. I heard from at least two people who are atheists or at least, agnostic, who bought the book because they want to know. And so what does that tell you? That there's something going on, that we see these things, we see enough evidence of something that seems off kilter. We want to understand it. Now, Hollywood knows that exists and people want these stories. And so they've gone out of their way to make them. I mean, the horror flick movie industry is expanding like crazy. I mean, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but when you go through the past few years, more and more of these films, not only are they coming out, they're performing at the box office. And there are some movies, by the way, like The Conjuring. Now, I'm not talking about the later Conjuring movies. I know there's another one coming out this year. But the initial one, where the focus of the film, according to the filmmakers, was to show the struggle of good and evil and to show how you can overcome evil. And so there are some movies. Now, I think with Annabelle and the dolls, they've gotten off track from that. But there are some movies where you could say, okay, they're trying to actually get at something deeper here. And they're trying to, but most of the movies are not necessarily doing that, but they're addressing the issue. And in the book, I think it was Pastor Lucas Miles, who we interviewed in the book. He said something that was very interesting. He said he felt like Hollywood addresses the issue, not that they do it better, more than some churches do. And that's a little convicting and stirring, I think, for us to talk about and consider.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. Over the last few years, I've encountered a few filmmakers who have written these possession, demonic themed stories, and they're actually Christians trying to open people up to the reality of the demonic in our world today. I think that's a unique and kind of out-of-the-box way to do it through a horror film. Yet, this is a way they're trying to work out their faith and express what they want to make sure people are aware of. So definitely a unique way to try to get there. Let's jump back now to talk about churches, church leadership. We've already mentioned that not every church wants to talk about these sorts of themes. They're kind of scared about it. I've heard lots of people who have said, hey, I went and talked to my pastor about this problem I had, and he's just kind of deer in the headlights, like, they didn't cover this in seminary. Sorry, go get a book or something. But in terms of whether we're talking about pastors or churches in general, why is there this struggle to even talk about this subject, let alone know what to do if somebody knocks on your office door and says, hey, I have a problem, I need help?
There are so many issues, and I dealt with this in the book in Playing with Fire, and there's so many reasons for it, I think. And I think part of it is a fear of the issue in terms of not wanting to look weird or strange. And I don't want to imbue this on people. I don't want to say this is why all pastors are not talking about it, but I do feel, even having written this book, I was able to get better responses from some Hollywood actors, okay, and actresses in terms of endorsing the book than I was able to get some pastors to agree to be interviewed for it. So to me, any pastor on the face of the earth should be able to be interviewed on the topic and asked about it, right? Because now I'm not saying that, and I'm not targeting anyone here. I just found it strange that I'm going to Chris Palaha and Candace Cameron Bure, and I'm like, hey, can you endorse this? And they're endorsing it very quickly without any problem. And I'm not able to get a pastor to come and talk to me about it. I mean, now, again, I think part of it is the weirdness of it. But the other part, and this is the well-intentioned part, I think there's sometimes a fear among Christians that if we lead with things like the demonic or the end times, that people are going to think we're nuts and we're actually not going to reach people, right? It's more about like we're not going to reach them because they think we're weird. So we talk about the feel-good stuff first, that Jesus can change you and transform you, and that's the core of the gospel. He died for our sins and all of that, which is where our focus should be. So, and by the way, there are some Christians that start witnessing by talking about the end times and the demonic, and to me, that is not the best place to start. So I understand that fear. But I also think there's probably some ignorance about it because admittedly, I was very ignorant on this. And in some ways, I'm still learning. And I wrote the book on it, right? So I think that we don't like things that make us, even though we want to be entertained, we don't like things that convict us or make us scared or make us think, oh gosh, there's something evil in the world, or there's a force, and wow, Satan's trying to steal and destroy. And it's just like we don't want to think about it. But what was remarkable, we did a survey in Playing with Fire through HarperCollins where we went to church leaders, and the full results are in the book, but we talked to about 1,200 people. And these were pastors, people in ministry, throughout church leadership. And 80 to 85% of them believe that obviously demons exist, that they have an impact on people's lives. But 78% of them felt that churches and pastors are not talking enough about it. And I thought that was fascinating. Well, we all believe it, but almost the same percentage is like, we're not talking about this enough. And so I think there's a thirst there. And I'm hoping that not just this book, but other books like it can help move that conversation forward because we need to have it.
Well, another question I will often, pretty much anytime I talk to an author who's written a book about demons and deliverance, is the question about demonic oppression versus demonic possession. I feel like people often kind of combine those two or kind of assume they're the same thing. I would love to have you just jump into telling us a little bit about, in your research, what did you discover is kind of the difference between those two? Because a lot of times people just assume they're the exact same thing.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, with that came the question, can a Christian be possessed, right? And this is a question that the faith leaders debate in the book. And I talked to a number of pastors and people who are dealing with this issue every day in their ministry. There's also infestation, right? Which is the possession of a place and not a person, right? And so we could talk about that after. But the interesting thing is that the consensus among those I spoke with, right? And I had a pool of people I'm talking to. Obviously, possession is a very rare thing. And a possession is when you are completely overtaken, and it may be at moments or it may be for longer periods of time by the demonic, that it has control over you. It is essentially inside of you. It is possessing you. And so that, though, even the Catholic Church, and they're the ones who... The Catholic Church has a very specific way of dealing with this issue. So when you were saying before that people will go to their pastors and they're like, what do I do? And the pastor's like, I don't know. This wasn't covered in seminary. A lot of people end up going to the Catholic Church because there's a specific exorcism rite. They have specific tools they use. Now, Pentecostals, there are plenty of Pentecostals and others in the Protestant realm who deal with this issue, but they will all tell you, everyone I spoke to, that there's not a demon behind every corner. Not everything is demonic. And that possession, again, very rare. The vast majority of cases that the Catholic Church is called to investigate, they will tell you that it turns out that very few of them are actually exorcism cases. Now, oppression, however, demonic oppression, from what experts say, is very different. It is something that could affect anybody, a Christian, a non-Christian. It can be as simple as thoughts that are coming into your mind, ideas that are being placed before you. It can be that you're being attacked in some way, and that can manifest itself in different ways, right, in your life. It may be that certain struggles hit you. And it seems like, and you were saying this before, among people who have written on this topic or addressed it, that many of them will report dealing with oppression, that they feel that they're kind of being, it's almost like somebody's pushing you down, right? They're trying to hold you down. They're not inside of you. They're not controlling your arms and your legs and your back, but it's holding you down. It's holding you back. And so there's a real difference between those two things, though, because oppression doesn't control you. It inflicts you, right, in some way. And so that's probably the best way to explain the difference. Now, the question of can you be possessed as a Christian is very interesting, and people had all sorts of different answers. The general answer was no. If you're a spirit-filled Christian who is following your faith, that evil can't live at the same time as the Holy Spirit can within you. But then you get into some really interesting conversations. Well, what if you are slipping away from your faith? Or what if you're moving away from your faith? And by the way, this is all predicated on whether or not you believe you can lose your faith, right? So that debate is related to this. But at what point have you fallen so far that you no longer have God's protection, right? And so that is a question that the book can't answer, but it goes into it and gives a lot of perspective on it. And I found I had never thought about that, right? And I do interview somebody in the book, the woman I mentioned, Amy, who was a churchgoer and felt she was a Christian at the time when she was possessed. And she cannot pinpoint what it was that opened the door for her to that experience. And that's rare. Most people could say, they could say, I did this, I did that, I went to psychics, whatever. They can pinpoint it. She wasn't able to pinpoint it. And so her story was unique and interesting. But yeah, so I hope that answers your question. It's sort of a lot of information condensed into here.
Yeah, I'd love to have you touch on the topic of infestation. I don't feel like that comes up as much in books that I've encountered on deliverance. Interestingly enough, a number of years ago, there was a film called Deliver Us from Evil, based on a book written by Ralph Sarchie. The book was far scarier than the movie. I read the book and then I watched the film, and I was like, yeah, this film isn't scary at all. I read the book at night, which probably was a bad idea. But what was interesting about that book, two things. One, they focus quite a bit on infestation with some of the cases they're investigating, but also it really contrasted, and I want to get to this in another question a little bit further down the road here, kind of the difference between Catholic exorcism and those rites versus what evangelicals and charismatics are going after in terms of deliverance. So that's where we'll go next. But first, I would love to hear any commentary you have about what you discovered related to infestation, which is very, very unique, and I'm assuming would be very scary. Haven't encountered it yet. Hope never to.
Yeah, and not everybody believes in infestation, right? Some people believe it's only people, right? That only people can be possessed, that they can't, that a place cannot be infested. But basically, it's a similar premise. Something has happened in this location, okay, that is so evil or diabolical or problematic that it has opened a door to evil remaining there. And so people will often talk, when you think about haunted houses, the claims of a house being haunted and, somebody died and their spirit's remaining behind, which we could talk about too, whether that's the case or if it's just demons. But that's when we tend to sort of think about these things, right? Haunted houses, also, strange events happening in specific locations. I covered a story and I actually revisited it when I was at the Blaze about Bob Cranmer, a guy out in Pennsylvania who was a politician. And he has a book out as well talking about his experience. But the family bought a house. Long story short, strange things started happening in the house. And as time went on, it really inflicted the entire family. And so I won't go into all the detail, but I do in the book. He gets a chance to sort of explain what happened or what he claims happened. But in the end, they ended up having to hold services in the house. They brought priests in and pastors. This went on for 2 years trying to expel whatever was going on inside this house. And it manifested itself in physical violence, in scratches, in bite marks, and the things, again, that you hear in possession cases happening inside of these locations. Some of the experts I spoke with would tell me that if there was drug deals going on in a particular location, that was something that could open the door to this sort of thing. In Bob Cranmer's case, he claims to have discovered, this is a very old house, that there was a murder at the home in like the 1800s or something, and that there was an illegal abortion clinic inside the home. That's the claim, right? That in the early 1900s, there was then a clinic there, and that this may have been what opened that door. Now, you're going to have a lot of discussion and debate around whether this is true or not, but some people did tell me, listen, when you talk to exorcists, they'll tell you they deal with very few exorcism cases compared to infestation cases, that they're dealing a lot more with those kinds of location-based issues, which I found fascinating since we don't often talk about them.
Well, next, Billy, I'd love to have you kind of help us discern that difference between when is it appropriate to go after deliverance versus an exorcism. It's really intriguing in terms of the Catholic rite of exorcism. There's a whole hierarchy. It has to be approved for it to happen. The people who will go after performing an exorcism will come equipped with holy water and incense and blessed salt and a crucifix, a whole range of things. And you may have evangelicals or charismatics show up to do more of a deliverance, and they've got the Holy Spirit and they're just ready to go. So two different approaches to trying to deal to some degree with the exact same problem. So we'd love to have you just contrast or compare what you learned about approaching the problem from those two perspectives.
Yeah, it was really interesting talking to different people about and asking that question, why do the Catholics use tools and others don't? And the terminology gets so confusing because it means something different to everyone. So let's start there. Exorcism, like you were saying, in the Catholic Church, it's very specific. It's a Latin prayer. It's the same prayer every time. You're not going in and adapting much to the situation in terms of the actual prayer, right? It's pretty uniform. In the evangelical world and the Protestant world, you're dealing with a situation where that might happen, where there's consistency depending on the church or the denomination. But most of it is like you were saying, people go in and they're ready to go. They pray over the people who are inflicted. And I will tell you, I mean, you think about what we see the Catholic Church do, and it's very ceremonial, and there's holy water, and there's a lot going on. And you'll hear pastors on the other side say, well, we had the same effect. This was expelled with only praying. All you need is Jesus, right? You tell it it's not welcome, you get it out. Now they might not call that an exorcism. They might call that a deliverance still. Or for other people, deliverance is something that even Christians should go through. There are many who believe that it's possible because of oppression that you need a deliverance to get rid of the oppression that a Christian might have. So the demon's not inside of you, it's not controlling you, but you're being oppressed. And so you can get into this, and I go deep into this in Playing with Fire on the different definitions, and I ask people, define this, explain it to us, help us understand the terminology. But the hard reality is that the terminology is not streamlined. Only for the Catholics it really is. Outside of that, you're really dealing with a situation where faith leaders are going in, they recognize there is an issue happening. And by the way, before anybody makes a determination that they need, or most people, not anybody, I should say most people, that they need to do this sort of thing to heal a person, they also look into mental health to make sure. I mean, the Catholic Church and most Protestants are very diligent about this. Is the person experiencing a mental health issue, or is it possession or oppression, right? And we can get into that, but there's also a lot going into that, like what determines what's mental illness versus possession. So I hope that answers your question. But yeah, I think the idea of prayer being enough as an evangelical, that's appealing to me, right? That is appealing to me. But I did talk to some who said they weren't Catholic, but they said, well, there are times that we've found holy water and crucifixes to be effective, even though it's not part of our regular, that there was an aversion to a cross or an aversion to, and I found that interesting.
Would love to have you comment next, Billy, about how does the reality, if we're willing to embrace that demonic activity is real in our world today, how does that point us back to the gospel?
Yeah, it's when you talk about this, it almost feels like you're talking about some sort of novel, right? That isn't, because we get so stuck in the material, and that's a struggle for, again, this goes back to why don't people want to talk about it? Well, you sound potentially crazy to people when you start to talk about it. But when you sit down and you start to have a conversation about the fact that you and I are sitting here communicating in an existence in the universe, in the world, it's all weird. Like all of our actual existence is weird. So it becomes less weird to start talking about these things. But to answer your question, we're told throughout Scripture, we're told the nature of who Satan is. We see Satan appear in Genesis. right? Deceiving Adam and Eve. We see him again appear in Revelation, which is very interesting. He's at the beginning, he's at the end, and this battle over good and evil. And we see it in life in general. I mean, turn on the news, watch what is happening in the world. There are so many times during the week where I'm just like, that is so evil. Like the thing that a person is saying or doing, it's not just I disagree with it. There's something wrong. And you can see it in the crimes and the events that happen. And many times people will tell you that they have been afflicted. I mean, I've seen stories where people have said, oh, I wasn't controlling myself, somebody else was. Now, whether that's true or not, it's an interesting claim. But how does it point us back to Jesus? Well, it shows us our need for Jesus, right? We're told in Ephesians that we need to cling to Jesus, take up the shield of faith, that's how we push back against this. And I think that so many people are afraid when you don't need to be afraid. If you are following Christ, if you are living a Christian life and you're living a prayerful life, that is the best way to protect yourself, to take up the shield of Christ, right? We're told that in Ephesians. That is what we need to be doing. So it points us, the existence of evil points us back to Christ. And the idea, when you look at Satan and you look at every description of him, and I break these out in the book because I never thought of, okay, Satan's bad, he's evil, we know that, right? But when you look at the descriptions, it's everything not to be as a human being. It's everything that is wrong with our world, deception, trying to tear us away from God, not just trying to confuse us, but to destroy us, right? And I found that very interesting. Many of the people who experienced possession or oppression, they have thoughts of ending their life. They have thoughts of destroying themselves. And so you look at that pervasiveness of who Satan is, and it points us right back to Christ. What is our solution for everything in culture right now? It's Christ. What is our solution for the division, the racism, the chaos, the hate? It's Christ. And so the need for us to transform our own individual hearts so that we can collectively have change. If you're looking for change, it has to happen at the individual level, right? That's how lasting change happens. And that's not a political statement. That is a spiritual statement. We need to be concerned about where people are going when they die. And so I think we can't, and I mean, I don't know. I feel like we almost can't understand the fullness of the need for Christ until we understand the fullness of the evil of sin, and who better to show us that than Satan. But also outside of that, we need to realize that a lot of what is happening around us, not everything, there's not a demon behind every door, which I said before, but what is happening in our world, there's a blindness, and we're told that as well, right? That the minds of unbelievers, there's a blindness there. And so we're seeing that manifest itself more and more, I think, in culture, not just in America, but around the world. And if we're to believe the Bible, we're going to see more of that. And so these are signposts that I think help us point back towards Christ. And the other thing is, if somebody's truly afflicted, even if it's rare, right? We know it happens, and we've seen these cases, and we're not treating them with the best treatment possible, they're not going to get that healing, right? So, and that's something that came up with some mental health providers I spoke with for the book, because that was something that was important to me to understand that is something they're concerned about. You know, you can give people medication all day long, you can give them counseling all day long, but if in their individual case there's something else going on, well, isn't it in their best interest to address what that something is? And so that's a very flammable area, obviously, when it comes to mental health and spiritual health, but it's an important one to talk about.
Yeah, I had an interesting conversation earlier this year with a mental health professional who wrote a book looking at different accounts from the Old Testament and New Testament and trying to figure out how would I diagnose that person? What was King Saul dealing with? Or what was this person dealing with? It was an interesting way to approach the Bible, but also try to look at mental health and the demonic. So just a very, very unique read, but also very fascinating. And I like what you said in terms of couching this in kind of a full Bible perspective, that we are part of an ongoing story that is unfolding, sort of that battle between good and evil. I love that Jesus is the answer. Like we learned in Sunday school, Jesus is always the answer. I feel like when people encounter things like Michael Heiser's book, The Unseen Realm, one of my favorite books, when people get a grid and a framework to start looking, or a lens to begin looking through, then they're like, oh, there's this kind of unified story that's been going on throughout all of time and the history of the world, if you will. And
Michael Heiser's interviewed. He's interviewed in this book, just so you know, Michael Heiser. So I had to mention that. I'm a Michael Heiser fan.
Good. Me too. Mike's one of my favorite authors. I'm always curious also to find out, I think this is your fourth book, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So, obviously my whole world is focused on working with authors. And I know whether it's your first book, your 51st book, every single writing journey shapes you. It changes you. You learn something. God teaches you something. So with the journey of writing Playing with Fire, like what did you learn? How were you changed? What was kind of the gem that you were able to take out of this process?
Yeah, I think for me the gem was that I've spent a lot of time trying to understand what in the world is going on right around us, and I think, we know as Christians what is going on, but I think our mind has to catch up to our heart, or vice versa, at some point. And when I look through the books that God has allowed me to write, I never write a book, and I said this in an interview earlier, and it sounds like I'm lying, but I'm not. I don't write books to make money. I write books because I'm interested in the topic. And at the end of the day, if I never write another book again, and Playing with Fire is the last book that I wrote, then that's God saying, you're done writing books. Like, you did what you were supposed to do, right? And I'm okay with that. I'm sure no publisher wants to hear that. But I want people to read it because I want them to be impacted. But for me, I was impacted in thinking back. The first book that I wrote was about the end times, and it was really similar thing through the lens of trying to understand, what do Christians believe. The second book was called Fault Line, and it was about culture. Where are we right now? How did we get here? How did media and Hollywood and universities shape us into what we are right now? And then there was a third book that was about a terrorism survivor, a young guy who survived 2 terror attacks, and just a really crazy, incredible story. And I came alongside him and wrote that. And so I look at all those things, and it's kind of interesting, the journey you don't realize you're on of trying to understand, right? So I'm looking at the end times. I'm looking at where are we headed. Then I got a chance to look at culture. Where are we now? Then I got a chance to look at a specific example of somebody's story as a result of maybe where we are right now spiritually. And then I felt like this book, I really had a chance to look at what is going on that we're not seeing, that is influencing everything else, and that is going to lead us back, or lead us rather where we are going to end up as a culture, as a society, at what Revelation tells us about, where we're headed. And so it just gave me peace, I think. And that's an ironic and a strange thing maybe for this topic, but I felt at peace in understanding more of what I'm not seeing, and also knowing that not everything is material. We are so obsessed with the material world, and this is what drives secularism, right? Everything is the here and now. Nothing else matters. But if you can't explain how you got here, you've got a big problem. We all internally want to know that, and not only how we got here, but how the system in which we've arrived here works. And so this book showed me that and gave me peace, I think, and not just peace, but the realization that Christianity, and I knew this before, but to live it out more, is not just this label we throw on ourselves. Ephesians 6 makes it clear we need to have that shield up, and to put that shield down at any point puts us in spiritual danger, puts us in danger in every way.
Well, Billy, I know some of the viewers, some of the listeners are definitely going to want to find out more about you, find out more about your book. So where can we go on the web to connect with you and find out more?
So I'm on social media. Billy Hallowell is my handle everywhere, but also playingwithfirebook.com. I'd encourage people to grab copies of it, not because it's a sales pitch, but because I really believe that it's a topic that we need to be talking about. And I would encourage you also head over to billyhallowell.com. And I actually write daily. I'm giving you a lot of websites, guys, but I write daily at insider.pureflix.com. There's a lot of Bible verses and interviews and things over on the PureFlix Insider. So check that out as well.
And like we do with every episode, just to make it easy, we'll have detailed links in the show notes, places where you can connect with Billy, pick up your very own copy of the book as well. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Billy Hallowell. Once again, our book today was Playing with Fire, a modern investigation into demons, exorcism, and ghosts. For more on Billy in the book, a great place to start is playingwithfirebook.com. For all other things Billy Hallowell related, head over to his website at billyhallowell.com. And Billy, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been a joy. It's been an honor to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.